All right, the case for advertising. No one admits to liking commercials, but the fact of the matter is we do like commercials when we sit and watch them. We may complain about the fact that commercials are around us. If we're in the online space and we have the opportunity to skip past the commercial, many times we'll take it. But if we sit there and we watch it, a lot of times we will be mesmerized by the message that is being sent over to us. The enormous expenditure by advertisers to attract the attention of those consumers shows just how influential commercials really are. So there's an investment that's made by advertisers, not just in the airtime that's being purchased, but in the creative that goes into creating that commercial, the equipment that it takes to put that together, or hiring a creative agency to put the advertisement together. We are talking thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to put a message together. And if it wasn't worth it to advertisers, they wouldn't be doing it. So there is a value there that advertisers see in putting those messages together, because they fully expect that there'll be people that will see it and be influenced by it. Immunity to advertising is one of humankind's most comforting self-delusions. Basically, what that means is that whether we admit it or not, we are all influenced by advertising in one way or another. You can think of advertising basically as a form of propaganda. Propaganda is a method of trying to convey a message and help that message to be accepted by the person that's receiving that message. Advertising is just a form of that. So advertisers put their message out there. They're trying to put themselves in their best light. They're trying to convince you of what it is that they're saying to you through all these different creative means. And, well, sometimes it works, which is why they do it. Okay, so what business are we in? If focus on the customer is the basis for sales on electronic media, then Clear Channel's Lowry Mays answered the question, what business are we in? The answer to that question, we are in the customer's business. Not in the customer business, we are in the customer's business. So the business that the customer himself, herself is in is the business that we are in, because we are focusing on the customer, what the customer needs. So whatever their business, their product or service that we're dealing with them on at that moment, we're in their business to help them sell what it is that they want to sell. Couple of ways to think about this. The book offers this example here. Railroads didn't stop growing because passengers didn't want to travel. Railroads used to be the main means of transportation of traveling across the country. But railroads have been in decline all through the 20th century and into the 21st century. Well, how come? The railroads let other means of transportation take their customers away. So the advent of the automobile, the advent of the airplane, all sorts of other means of transportation coming along as well. And railroads didn't necessarily see that as a threat. They didn't do much to combat it, and people gravitated toward those other means of transportation. Railroads perceive themselves to be in the railroad business, not in the transportation business, and that is part of the problem. So if you are putting yourself out there and think people are going to come to you just because you are who you are, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. People are not going to advertise on your radio station or your television station simply because you are a radio station or a television station. You are a vehicle by which a consumer, an advertiser rather, is able to reach out to consumers. How well you do that, how well you cater to them in doing that, is going to determine whether or not they use your service. Another example from the book. A hardware representative once said that his product was quarter-inch drill bits, but all of his customers ever wanted were quarter-inch holes. The drill bit was just a means for creating the holes that those that were purchasing the drill bits were looking to get. The drill bit is just a means for making that happen. As such, in our example with advertising, the advertising is not the thing that the advertiser wants. What the advertiser wants is increased business, and advertising is the vehicle through which they are able to potentially increase their business. The core business of electronic media, then, is helping clients achieve their sales and marketing goals. And that's what it is that we have to offer in broadcasting sales. There are three beneficiaries of the advertising that you sell. First off, there's the consumer. The consumer saves time and trouble in shopping, comparing brands, and testing results. The information provided in advertising helps them to be able to see why company A thinks they're the best, why company B thinks they're the best, why company C thinks they're the best, and how they believe they can do better than the other companies. Consumers become informed. Businesses are beneficiaries as well. Businesses cut selling costs and save time for sales representatives. Instead of having their salespeople hitting the pavement, going door to door, telling people about what it is they have to offer, they can reach mass numbers of people by using advertising. Thirdly, the economy benefits. Advertising sells products, which means jobs for workers, which means workers have money to buy products advertised. And that's considered to be a win-win for everybody. Okay, let's look on now to the story of advertising, looking in a little bit into the history of how advertising came to be what it is today. The earliest advertisements in English are still with us through the form of people's surnames or people's last names. Many times in the olden days, their last name was the occupation, what they did back then. So someone that was named blacksmith was indeed a blacksmith. Somebody that was named porter would have been a porter, transporting goods from one to the other. My last name, Brucker, I looked it up on a website, and my last name means someone that lived by a bridge, someone that keeps a bridge. So there may have been Bruckers in history that were toll takers for different bridges. So there, your last name may possibly mean that you have a tradition of some sort of business that was carried on by your family several centuries ago. With the increase of trade came the need for identification with the products or services each person could provide. So as time went on, people from generation to generation learned new trades, and the last name wasn't necessarily going to tell them what they did. So they started to come up with ways to be able to identify themselves with whatever it is that they provided to the public. Well-known historical figures from the colonial period of the United States believed in advertising. One of the ways they did that was by way of trade cards. Trade cards were oversized business cards that were lavishly illustrated, and they were handed to the public to drum up business. So even nowadays, people will hand out a business card when you're networking and meeting someone on the street and that sort of thing. Lets you know how to contact them, what company they're associated with. Trade cards were a much larger version of that. As commerce progressed, advertisers started expanding towards signage. One of the ways they did signage was through these things called bill posters. And that was going to be a major way for many companies to be able to advertise. If you've noticed a lot of older pictures of posters from late in the 1800s on into the first part of the 20th century, these bill posters would have promoted things like the circus. P.T. Barnum was known for making posters when the circus was coming to town. A lot of concerts in the 50s and 60s, even going into the early 80s, with these bill posters, would help to promote those sorts of events. But many other businesses used them as well. In 1841, a Philadelphia man named Vonnie Palmer founded what appears to be the first advertising agency. Palmer described himself as a newspaper agent. He made it clear to advertisers that he worked for the publishers, though. So this was kind of that aspect of working for the particular company. And, he would go and go to prospective advertisers and say, hey, I represent such and such newspaper, and you need to advertise in our newspaper. So I'm out here representing the newspaper, and why don't you come on along and advertise with us? The advantage of his service was that savings of cost and time on behalf of the prospective advertiser, if they were looking to advertise. Before he came along, they would have to contact various publishers themselves, calling each and every one and finding out rates and learning how to get their announcements published and that sort of thing. But Palmer, in his setup, was basically one-stop shopping. You can contact him and he could get you into several different publications. When George Rowell came along, he kind of changed things up a little bit. He calculated realistic estimates of newspaper circulation. Let's try that again. He calculated realistic estimates of newspaper circulation and then guaranteed the publishers cash payments. He bought newspaper space at what we would call wholesale rates and then resold it to advertisers at retail. So he kind of changed things around a bit. He didn't necessarily work for the newspapers, but he would actually buy the ad space in the newspapers himself and then go out and resell it. So he was a middleman of sorts that was kind of working in between the newspaper and the advertiser. And he started doing a lot of things differently that kind of started what we think more as the aspects of how advertising sales works today. First off, he became a space wholesaler for small newspapers. This would be kind of the same as, say, like a network rep today or an advertising agency that works independent from TV and radio stations but consults with them. So he would be a wholesaler. And then he began a flat 25% commission structure. So let's say that if he was selling advertising space for $100, then he would send $75 of that to the publishing company and keep 25% for himself. He announced a policy of working only for the advertiser, not for the newspaper. So in this case, again, because he's not working for the newspaper, he already bought the ad space. So now he is challenged with going out and reselling it. So he is trying to work in the advertiser's best interest, make the advertiser happy so that they will buy off of him to help him recoup his losses and make a profit in the process. He collected all of his data about circulation figures and made it public in Rowell's American Newspaper Directory, which first appeared in 1869. So he basically would publish different companies and their rates for advertising and use that as a guide for himself and for his prospective advertisers. He also founded Printers, Inc., a crusading trade magazine for the advertising industry that lasted well into the 20th century. Little side note here before we go on. This was from the insert in your textbook. The word slogan comes from the Gaelic slogarum, and what that basically means, slogan basically means a battle cry. The word now stands for a phrase used in order that the prospect may become favorably disposed toward the article for sale. So if you think about that, when a company comes up with a slogan that helps you to identify what the company is, or tie that slogan into the company, it very much works in the same way that a battle cry does. You have McDonald's, for example. Everyone knows their slogan nowadays. I'm loving it. And you hear I'm loving it, you automatically think of the Golden Arches. It's a very distinct sort of thing that is associated with McDonald's. The same way that a battle cry would be very distinct for an army. So that's kind of how that works. There's that distinction. Nowadays, it's not so much going into battle as much as it is trying to create this favorable disposition. So you think happily about McDonald's Big Macs when you hear that slogan, I'm loving it. Brand identity. Advertising, of course, sells more than just a product. It also sells image, the combined total of the impressions, promises, perceptions, and experiences with a product or service. All of those factors weave information about a brand into the consumer's mental storehouse. So we're talking about reputations here. We're talking about association with quality or cost or convenience or whatever the major selling point is, the image, the reputation that the advertiser wants to leave in the impressions of its customers. So advertising is selling image. Now, brand identity is a specific combination of visual and verbal elements that help to achieve recognition of the brand and differentiation from other brands. Who are you? What are you all about? What makes you different from everybody else? What makes McDonald's different from Burger King or Wendy's? Why should I shop with you and not with the other folks? Let's take a look now at some of the components of brand identity. Here's just a few things that are going to be comprised into this. First off, the name of the brand. There's logos. So we've talked about the Golden Arches with McDonald's. There's the Nike swoosh symbol. There's the lettering that's used in Coca-Cola. All of that is considered to be with a certain look, a certain appeal. Symbols such as Mickey Mouse or Ronald McDonald. So the characterization, spokespeople types of things. Slogans and messages. I'm loving it. Just do it. Eat more chicken. All those sorts of things associating with particular companies. Color, such as the IBM blue. We may not necessarily think of color so much per se, but there are colors that, especially if you're looking in certain industries, a lot of companies are associated with a certain color. In the tech world, for example, Intel is known as blue, while AMD, the competing processor, is known as Team Red. So color sometimes can play a factor. Package configuration, such as the Campbell's red and white soup can label. And product configuration, such as the original Coca-Cola bottle. All of these things play into brand identity. When you see it, when you hear it, you recognize it as being associated with a particular company. Advertising carries as much of the brand message today as the product itself does, and brands are reinforced by their exposure in our commercials. So we see here that the more and more that we use brand names and logos and slogans and all that sort of thing, the more that we are exposed to it, the more that we identify it with a particular company. The dictionary defines brand as to mark indelibly as proof of ownership. It also means a sign of quality. Marketer Larry Light, who chairs the Coalition for Brand Equity, adds to the definition. A brand is a trademark that differentiates a promise associated with a product and identifies the source of that promise. So the idea of brand is, we talk about things like what's in a name. Well, brand is kind of the same sort of thing. So you associate a certain name, a certain brand with a certain ownership, a certain quality, a certain product, a certain reputation. All those sorts of things tie in to the value, to the strength, to the reputation of a brand. CBS was the first major broadcaster to brand itself, both on the air and in its corporate communications, imposing the CBSI logo on everything. So, in the broadcasting world, CBS, the first to really kind of identify itself with a particular logo and a particular branding. Advertising and electronic media. The first advertiser on radio was a record retailer in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. This is all associated with the first radio station, 8XK, which later became KDKA. And basically, what happened was that the music broadcast would be sponsored by the local department store in southwestern Pennsylvania, and that you could hear the broadcast from Horne's department store. And by the way, Horne's was the place to go and buy a receiver so that you can have a radio at home and listen to the broadcast instead of hanging out outside of Horne's. AT&T's New York station, WEAE, inaugurated a policy of continuous broadcasting with a rate card based on time. They would charge $100 for 10 minutes. So this was the first foray into formalizing the idea of soliciting and actively recruiting folks to come on the air and basically have the airtime to say whatever it is that they wanted. There were a lot of personal messages that were paid for by this method, but companies used it as well. By the late 1920s, radio became as inexorably linked to the concept of advertising as newspapers had been. Radio became the advertiser's dream as it linked the nation in the 1930s with variety shows, orchestras, comedians, and daily dramas that reflected real-life stories. Those dramas became known as soap operas because of the advertising aimed at women who were not in the workforce at the time. They were selling them soap and using the soap opera to be able to do so. The first real television commercial came about in, 1954. In 1954, Rosser Reeves of the Ted Bates and Company scratched out on a napkin a visual advertisement for Anacin for fast relief. And before that, ads on television were largely product demonstrations performed live on camera. But what Reeves did was, in putting a graphic together of this skull that was getting these headaches and this pressure in the head from the hammer and from the lightning bolt, and then showing how Anacin takes care of all that quickly, it became a very different way of advertising. He basically transformed advertising from low-keyed salesmanship into high-powered persuasions. He believed that commercials should be mind-pulverizing. To be effective, they had to bludgeon people into buying. Now, that seems rather crude and harsh and horrible, but if you think about a lot of effective advertising today, a lot of the stuff that catches people's attention are the ads in which they do something that is unexpected. do something that is out of the ordinary. Watch a lot of the commercials that are on YouTube nowadays and some of the outlandish things that they will do to try to keep your attention, capture your attention, and oh, by the way, you need this product in your life. So he was a bit ahead of his time, but he pioneered this whole idea of advertising as being more than just here's the product and here's what it does. Reeves is also credited for the first TV advertising for a presidential candidate. His ads for the 1952 Eisenhower campaign were attacked as Machiavellian. In other words, it was cunning, it was scheming, it was unscrupulous, because they had sold the candidate like a toothpaste. Again, very different approach to what was originally done. Candidates would go from town to town and they would talk about their promises and try to put on a good image. Well, Reeves put him out there like he was a product, and it was effective. All right, today's television environment. Tony Schwartz says electronic media is the second God in an analogy of how media influences our lives and shapes our beliefs. Media are all knowing, he writes. They supply a community of knowledge and feelings and a common morality. Now, with that, Schwartz feels that we all have a responsibility to use the second God as a social instrument in the hands of society. He understands that most effective commercials do not tell us what to do or how to react, but rather they present carefully chosen stimuli that evoke certain inner connections and elicit the desired behavior or reaction. So basically, it's this idea that there's this authoritative being, if you will, that being the means of communication, radio, television, print, the advertising vehicle that is being put out en masse to anybody and everybody. And because it's reaching so many people, it has that ability to influence culture and influence thinking. The framework of a television program is television itself. That means that the commercial you sell fits into three contexts: the need or desire on the part of the consumer, the context of advertising, and the context of television. This is basically another means of talking about the two core basic questions that we have with any form of communication. Number one, what is your message? Number two, who is your audience? If you know what your message is, if you know who your audience is, if you understand how that message gets conveyed to the audience and what the limitations of the medium are, then you are able to shape your message and make it effective to work in that particular environment. Speaking of, let's talk about the electronic media environment. Typically, new media have done some key things better than old media. Not only are new media additive, but often cooperative. So what this means is that as new media has come along, while there have been ways that older media have suffered as a result because of the new and the fresh and the updated and the more capable in certain ways compared to older media still has its place. Sometimes older media has had to kind of transform itself, like in the example of radio, when television came along. And television was able to show pictures and be flashy and be able to add to the message that it was trying to convey. Radio turned to a more local focus. It focused on a more intimate sort of feel. And radio has been able to continue to survive as a result of that. And now, with television struggling with cable and new media that is out there, television is also having to adapt the way that it works with its advertising. Radio's deregulation in 1996 yielded unprecedented consolidation through mergers of the largest radio companies in the market-dominant clusters. Small companies that couldn't compete against the mega operations were ripe for acquisition. Companies that owned A-level stations bought C-level stations. and that elevated the industry with better programming and better selling. Now, that's something that may be up for debate. You can talk about whether advertising has gotten better as a result of media companies coming together or not. You definitely have more resources in these larger companies to be able to produce different sorts of things, but you can make the argument, at least from the programming side, as to whether these things have gotten better and have been more beneficial. And that's been a debate that's been going on ever since deregulation happened back in 1996. Nation's top 25 TV station groups owned or controlled 30% of the 1,202 commercial stations on the air in 1997. Nowadays, 90% of all media is owned by 6 companies. So there is a lot of integration that is out there and consolidation. That is something to keep in mind in terms of the strength of those that are continuing to run, the resources they have to be able to sell to others, to bring in revenue, and does make for a rather lopsided competitive environment. National television networks faced erosion of shares as new media outlets challenged them. Even in the face of declining shares, national TV networks commanded the highest prices ever for 30-second commercials on leading programs. So there's a bit of a paradox here in that even though television's viewership has been going down over the years, that the costs of production have gone up, the costs of talent has gone up, the cost of equipment has gone up, and therefore the cost of advertising still continues to go up. And they can do so because they can still tout some of the benefits that television has in reaching its audience in ways that radio and internet and newspapers and others cannot do. So what about the internet? Nielsen reviewed its People Meter panel and found that there was a decline in TV usage in internet households during certain times of the day. Now, keep in mind, this book's about 20 years old, so we've been seeing that number go down and down and down even more in the past 20 years. And with a lot of people watching video online these days, that is becoming even more pronounced. Newspaper and print. Print ads still command huge shares of the national advertising dollar. Newspapers have the advantage of being visual with direct impact when the consumer is ready to shop. There are some things that are still really good in terms of advertising through the newspaper, like what's the weekly specials at the grocery store, looking through classified ads, if you want to know prices and features of vehicles at the local dealership. Newspapers are still really good for that. In contrast to newspapers, magazines are highly targetable. There are thousands of specialty magazines that allow advertisers to target demographically by product affinity or by lifestyle. So magazines are kind of the radio of print medium, if you will. Newspapers reaching out to a broader audience in a community. Magazines reaching out to people with specified interests. Product life cycles. Each medium is a product. Like a product, each medium has a life cycle that can be measured in different stages. First stage, introduction. It's a brand new thing. Second stage, growth. Third stage, maturity. Fourth stage, saturation. And then finally, decline. At its introduction, a product requires many more resources than it can hope to return. However, once the product reaches growth, each new dollar invested produces many dollars in return. Peter Drucker says, when product reaches maturity and becomes today's breadwinner, the incremental acquisition to be gained by additional input goes down sharply. In other words, the market for the product is at saturation and decline is imminent. So you kind of see this circle of life that is going on with just about every different aspect of what goes on in the life of the sales cycle. And each electronic medium can be viewed in terms of its own place in its life cycle. We've talked about that a little bit already with radio and television and print, and how all those things have had to readjust themselves in order to try to continue to survive in the light of new opportunities that are out there. And how they will continue to make themselves relevant as we go on in the world of communication. And the biggest thing is going to be to keep relevant so that they can keep attracting advertisers. And the biggest way that radio and TV is doing that these days is by becoming more customer focused, realizing that it's not just the fact that they have advertising for sale that's going to attract advertisers to them, but that the particular radio station, the particular TV station is able to meet the needs of that particular advertiser for whatever the problem is they're trying to solve, for whatever goals it is that they have to increase business with a certain product or increase business within a certain area or to create a reputation for themselves in one way or another. Radio and TV are doing their best to make sure that they are the medium that is going to be able to help them to do that. And it's the job of the salesperson to make sure that that message is conveyed and to be able to convince the prospective advertiser to come on with them because they have the best way of doing that.